Australian. We're going to have an interview for you in just a moment. Now, before we get started in today's interview with author and filmmaker Trevor Loudon, I want to refer you to a report that's come out overnight. And last night, it turns out that several people were denied entry to Box Hill Town Hall in Victoria, where Dan Andrews was scheduled to speak. Despite having valid tickets, some were denied entry, with very few exceptions, were white Australians, according to Morgan Jonas and Chris de Bruin of Discoveries. Now, people said that they knew for a fact, because they had Chinese Australian friends who were granted admission, that event staff were indeed allowing in people who had not booked tickets in advance if they happened to be of East Asian appearance. Why the double standard? What's going on with the Labor Party? I'll get you to have a look at this, and then we'll get on with the show proper.
Happy to sign in. They're only allowing people of a very specific archetype in these doors. It's a closed doors meeting.
We're here to attend what's a public meeting, but apparently, if you've got a ticket, it is a positive valid.
They just said that's not with us. That's not part of this event.
I've got my ticket. I rang up and I confirmed it, and I'm happy to sign in and give my details.
Yeah.
And I'm here to, got this in the mailbox about...
So you got this in the mailbox. Are you local?
Yes.
So is it Matt Gregg, your films?
Local. So I'm here to speak to him.
There you go.
And they still won't let me in to see what he's got to say.
Unbelievable. So locals are getting these in the mail, and they're coming here, registering their name, registering their address, talking to the police, not being allowed in closed doors.
Penny Wong, why has Labor been restricting freedom of speech for Australians? Can you answer to that? Why weren't Australians allowed in tonight to this event? Why were only Chinese people allowed in?
Extraordinary, isn't it? There you saw Trevor. I'll bring him in just a moment. I just want to ask you a couple more questions before we get into the interview proper. Is climate change a religion or a cult? Is compulsory medicine really the future? Is digital ID and total surveillance on your bingo card? When did society switch from free will to hive-mindedness? Are we better off in any way, or are we just meant to feel safer? One thing we have learned over the past 5 years at least is that the more we want to be left alone, the more we are being controlled for our safety and our convenience. With distrust of mainstream politics at an all-time low in Australia, with an incumbent Prime Minister going back on his word for a COVID Royal Commission and overseeing a cost of living crisis, where young people have all but given up on the Australian dream, who is Anthony Albanese under the facade of the Aussie battler who's never had a real job in his life, an idealist, or something more sinister? Is Albo the perfect puppet for a grander global agenda? Well, Trevor Loudon is an author of 9 political exposé books, including Stealth, Kamala Harris's Communist Roots, Reds, Socialists and Security Risks Running for US President, Barack Obama and the Enemies Within. His latest book is Comrade Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese's 40-year alliance with Australian Communism. He's also a filmmaker and public speaker from Christchurch in New Zealand for more than 30 years. He's researched the radical left, Marxist and terrorist movements and their covert influence on mainstream politics. His websites are trevorloudon.com and kiwiki.org. Trevor Loudon, welcome to the Daily Australian.
Well, great to be here, Jason. Thanks for having me on, and greetings to the audience.
Well, Trevor, thank you for coming onto the show today, and your wisdom and your life's work is certainly going to be put to the test, if you will, what we're seeing right now. Now, I thought it was appropriate at the head of this interview to play something there. What do you think, just as an observer with a lot of experience in researching, what was your take on that short video clip that we saw out of Victoria last night?
Well, I noticed that Daniel Andrews was supposed to be on the bill, and so was Karina Garland. Daniel Andrews is extreme left, in bed with China for a very long time, and Karina Garland is very, very close to the Search Foundation, the continuation of the old Communist Party of Australia. And both of these, what they've been doing is really courting ethnic minorities, and that's part of the reason for the big upsurge in migration during Albanese's term, because the goal is to, as they have done in Canada, to import millions of Chinese and similar people into the country, not because of their race so much, but because of their political affiliation, their political background, their connections to the CCP and other foreign governments. And this is part of the subversive process for turning Australia into a socialist, communist nation. So it was quite interesting to see Karina, Garland, Daniel Andrews, and making sure that only ethnic people were getting into the meeting, because the ethnic people are the main target for the left. That's immigration bears that out, but not just immigration. There's two systems in Australia, one for your traditional Australians and one for minorities, and that's always been a part of the Marxist program.
I tell you what, there would be people watching, tuning into this and realising that those remarks, as startling as they sound, it seems, Trevor, that you've picked this up from years and years of research. I mean, you just picked it straight away.
Well, I've been doing this for 40 years. The communists have a thing, they call it the nationalities question. Stalin realised that you couldn't always just use the class struggle for revolution. Sometimes it was more productive to use minorities for a revolution. So it's actually a very scientific program. The nationalities question, if you don't have minorities in a country, you import them, and then you build up their rights, and you create friction with the native population, and you just get a chaotic situation developing, which the socialists then take advantage of. So it's a very scientific process. This is not new, and it's carried out all over the world, not just Australia.
Well, that was my next question, because it appears that this is a method or a plan or an agenda that's crossing all Western nations. And of course, the open borders scenario that we saw in the United States abruptly ended by Donald Trump's new administration. Does that therefore tell you that there is, at least in the US, we're seeing the globalist agenda, if you will, mirroring what you're saying is the communist agenda, and Donald Trump's certainly not a communist and definitely a nationalist, that we now have a resistance?
Well, the communist movement and the globalist movement overlap considerably. China is really the enforcement arm of the globalists. And so communist China is promoting this, like in the United States, it is the pro-Chinese communists that have pushed for the open borders. They are the immigration groups. They are the groups that hire lawyers to defend illegal immigrants. They are the people who pressure politicians to keep the borders open. This is a Chinese operation in America. So it's also a Chinese operation in Australia, and but in New Zealand as well. So they've deliberately imported lots of minorities into New Zealand. Then they stir up the native Maori population, and land rights, and just like they're doing with the Aboriginals here. So the goal is to balkanize the country. So you're not all Australians anymore, you are different groups. And these groups have competing interests, just like, the classes, the working class is supposed to have a different interest to the capitalist class. Well, that's old-fashioned, that's a bit bulky, that doesn't work very well. But when you can balkanize a society, when you can get different ethnic groups and religious groups competing against each other, some getting favoured by the government, some not being favoured by the government. Like anybody who's had a family knows, if you want to destroy your family, treat your kids differently. You treat your kids differently, your family's going to fly apart. Treat your different groups, and exacerbate these differences. Introduce legislation that treats certain groups differently, like the voice referendum was intended to do. You do that, you're going to balkanize the country, you're going to tear the country apart, and that's what the revolutionaries are after.
That is really interesting, and yet many will say that it's fairly obvious. But if we then juxtapose that against the entire trans agenda that we saw literally just burst out of nowhere, does that therefore for you draw similar comparisons therefore?
Yeah, look, the revolution used to be workers versus the bosses. Now the revolution is the sexual minorities versus the straights. That's gays, lesbians, but now gone even further into the transgender movement. Now some of the transgenders are fighting some of the gays, you know. So this is a process of fractionalizing the country. So now the Marxist revolution is driven through the transgender movement, through the Aboriginal voice movement, through the ethnic minorities movements, through some of the Muslim extremists, through the environmental movement. So communism, Marxism is very prevalent in Australia. It's very, very powerful. But because it's working in all these different sectors, people don't recognise it as the old communism of the past. It's what they call intersectionality. You know, the race struggle is connected to the class struggle, is connected to the gender struggle, is connected to the LGBTQ struggle, is connected to the environmental struggle. All these struggles overlap, but they're all Marxist driven. Every single one of them is Marxist driven. You know, the immigration upsurge in Australia is a Marxist program to bring more votes in for the left, to balkanize the country, to increase tensions and increase general dissatisfaction, which will then be preyed upon will be utilized by revolutionary forces.
Is it fair then to draw the comparison that any Marxist revolution, as you've sort of divided it into different categories and subjects, is always the collectivism of the perceived weak against the perceived strength, therefore?
Yeah, it is. Like okay, the old class struggle was the capitalists have all the wealth, right? But there's more, the workers are being oppressed. Their wealth is being stolen. They produce the wealth, but the capitalists steal it. Now it is the minorities are oppressed by the white Christian capitalist patriarchy. The women are oppressed by the male patriarchy, the male system. They're victims. Everybody is a victim. So if you want a revolution, you create as many victims as you can, and you turn the victims against those who currently occupy the power structure. You know, so that's how it is. It's the same. It's a Marxist principle applied to gender, applied to sexuality, applied to the environment, applied to racial conditions, but it's still the same Marxist agenda: the powerless against the powerful. So you want as many powerless people as you can, and you vilify anybody who's seen to have a little bit of power. Whether they do or not is really irrelevant. And that's how you get a revolution. And a lot of Australians don't sort of think of a Marxist revolution as being on the agenda. But, you know, we almost saw a complete communist program, the Voice referendum, permanently changed the constitution of your country. It came pretty close. And for a long time, people thought it would win. And thanks to the no vote and the people who organised that, it didn't. But that was probably a few hundred communists were on the verge of changing your constitution forever. They have a lot of power way more power than their numbers would tell you.
It seems that way. It also seems that in psychological terms, and I only mentioned it today on the Daily Australian radio show, what I call the drama triangle. If you imagine a triangle, three-tip triangle, of course, one corner you have the victims, another corner you have the rescuers, and at the top you have the persecutors. And it seems that in said drama triangle, it's always going to be 2 versus 1 if you can have those that have a perceived feeling that they need to provide for the victims. And this is the crazy thing about left-wing politics, is that it as much as it preaches egalitarianism, it's the opposite. It's creating a hierarchy in real time that whilst you might not be doing very well, there's always someone worse off than you that you need to help, therefore.
Yeah, look, that's right. And you only expiate the guilt of being white or being a business owner or whatever privileged position you happen to be in by devoting your time to helping the downtrodden. You know, like in America, you know, young white college kids have to practically genuflect to Black Lives Matter to expiate their white guilt. You know, so but the hierarchical point is great, because in a free, open society, every society has hierarchies, but in a free, open society, they're very flexible. You can move up or down depending on your merit. But in a socialist society, those hierarchies get locked in. There's no more hierarchical society than the socialist society. Because you look at Kim, Rocket Boy in North Korea, one of the richest men in the world, but most of his people live in abject poverty. And the only thing that keeps him in power is that strata of military and police that enforces his dictates. So socialism is not about equal sharing of the wealth. Socialism is about concentrating all wealth and all power in very few hands. All this wealth sharing, power sharing, that's just to get the people stirred up. That's just to get the people on board. But the professional revolutionaries know that when the revolution comes, they're going to be on top, and they're going to be driving the Mercedes, and they're going to be eating the caviar and the steaks, while everybody else is living in the co-op eating mung beans and biking to work in the morning.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? It's the great paradox of a system that's meant to explain what is supposed to be fair for everyone.
The results are the opposite of what they say they are. Exactly the opposite. And you don't have to be in the communist movement too long to understand that this is what you're about.
So to not put this to a vote is to concede defeat. You only win when you run on the field and engage. And let me tell you, my government is engaged. We're all in.